Threads was shown by the BBC in September 1984, and it was a major media event at the time. It got the front page of the Radio Times. It was a significant show. There was a lot of advanced publicity about it. It also happened at pretty much the height of nuclear anxieties and the sense that things were spiralling out of control. It was a very timely piece of drama, well promoted, and you have to remember as well that this is back in the days when there were only 4 television channels. So really, you could count on a fairly broad section of the population watching a drama that was shown in this way. Now, it's shown on BBC Two, which meant that it didn't get the figures it would have got if it had been shown on BBC One. Perhaps the one mystery, really, the one sign of nervousness on the part of the BBC was that they didn't screen it on BBC One. A year later, when it was repeated in 1985, they moved it onto BBC One. One feels really that it should have been on BBC One to begin with, but even on BBC Two it got 7 million viewers. It was a very significant programme, and there was a great deal of debate and discussion about it afterwards in the press. So really, as long as you were paying any kind of attention at all, you could scarcely fail to be aware of it at the time.
In an urban society, everything connects. Each person's needs are fed by the skills of many others.
The Radio Times was a publication at the time was devoted entirely to the output of the BBC. In later years it was privatised, the connection with the BBC was severed, and it started to cover all other TV channels as well. But at the time it was the official organ of the BBC that told you what was going to be on in the coming week. So it was a listings magazine with features and interviews. It had, at the time, a bit like the BBC, a reputation that was kind of slightly granny-ish, slightly auntie-ish. The term of endearment for the BBC at the time was Auntie Beeb, which gives you an idea of how the BBC positioned itself and how people treat it as a broadcasting phenomenon, part of the family, part of the furniture. Consequently, the Radio Times always looks rather staid. It was generally, the covers would have images of, light entertainment stars or people in the popular eye at the moment, and they were generally sort of very light, frothy, or rather staid and sensible covers. And so this cover for Threads actually broke the mould quite significantly at the time. And it shows in a way, I think, that the BBC knew that they had something potentially incendiary on their hands, and they wanted to ensure that people were going into the programme with no illusions about what they were in for. Now, back in the 1960s, the BBC had commissioned a show called The War Game by a director called Peter Watkins. This was meant to be a TV documentary about the effects of a nuclear attack on the UK.
9:16 a.m. A single megaton nuclear missile overshoots Manston Airfield in Kent and airbursts 6 miles from this position.
It was commissioned, it was directed and finished and made and edited, and then the BBC got cold feet and decided not to screen it. And after that, it was only ever shown in some cinemas. It was shown in labour clubs, places, sort of other than cinemas as well, trade union gatherings, things like that. It became very difficult to see unless you were going to slightly more politically motivated events, really. The War Game was perceived as a drama which was, actually the BBC were really frightened of the effect that it might have on the viewers. Remember, this is in the mid-60s. And the fear was, I think there was literally a fear at the BBC that people might commit suicide if they watched The War Game, that it was so disturbing and that it painted such a bleak picture of nuclear Armageddon that it might inspire people to actually kill themselves. This was this was a belief apparently held at the BBC, one of the reasons why The War Game was withdrawn and never shown. So when they finally decided to do something along the same lines in the 1980s, evidently at the top levels of the BBC there must have been discussion about how to pave the way and prepare audiences for what they were about to see, because frankly Threads is much, much more disturbing than even The War Game, which was a very accomplished piece of filmmaking. But Threads is a more disturbing experience, again, by several orders of magnitude. So I guess the Radio Times cover was a way of saying to audiences, this isn't just your average TV show, and this isn't just your average BBC products. We're dealing with something a bit edgier here, so beware.
Words and pictures. Skeletons and skulls.
The director of Threads, Mick Jackson, had already explored the ideas that Threads deals with to some degree in a half-hour documentary which he made the year before in May of 1983. Now, this was an episode of a science documentary strand on the BBC called QED, and the episode was called A Guide to Armageddon. It was a half-hour documentary slot looking at the potential effects of a nuclear explosion over London. It took St Paul's Cathedral as the epicenter of the attack, and then looked at the ways in which the blast would affect people several miles, 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, 5 miles out of the centre of London from there. It's a very powerful piece of work in its own right. It has some disturbing images in it which are not used in Threads. I think there's a sequence where you see a butcher's shop with legs of lamb hanging in the windows, and in order to illustrate very graphically what the heat blast would do to human flesh, it shows basically a leg of lamb being scorched and blasted with high temperatures, and you see the skin bursting and splitting and the flesh cooking and the fat bubbling. Whilst the voiceover by Ludovic Kennedy, actually, who's doing the voiceover, is explaining to you that this is what would happen to a human body if it was under the same conditions.
Everywhere inside this 7-mile radius, for example at the shops in Holland Park Avenue, the effect on directly exposed flesh is the same. It behaves like the meat in the butcher's window.
So that pulled no punches, and that was in 1982. Mick Jackson said that the initial idea for A Guide to Armageddon came when he was browsing through newspapers and noticed that there were an increasing number of advertisements in the classified sections of newspapers for fallout shelters of varying degrees of complexity, ranging from relatively cheap shed-like constructions to very elaborate metal tubes like mini submarines that, if you had the money, that you could implant in your garden and supposedly ride out the worst of the attack. He hit on the idea initially of doing a kind of consumer's guide to these devices, to these products. Consumer programs were very popular at the time, programs that would scrutinize the effectiveness of various consumer products and compare them. So he was kind of drawing on that almost in a sort of a slightly satirical way, I guess, initially, but looking at these often very expensive fallout shelters and subjecting them to scientific examination to see whether or not they'd stand up to the rigours of an actual attack.
And Wiliub is safe.
Once he got his teeth into that idea, he started shooting a lot more material, lots more ideas started to flood out. And there was really too much to use in a half-hour slot. So consequently, having done the half-hour QED episode, he was left with a lot of research materials and a lot of ideas about things which he wanted to take further, and that's how Threads developed. The political situation in the early 1980s was very, very tense. The relationship between the Soviet Union and America was at an all-time low. It was certainly at the lowest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. There'd been a number of events that had taken place in the early 80s which had led, really, the world to the brink of nuclear confrontation and nuclear annihilation. There was one event that happened in September of 1983 where a Russian military officer called Stanislav Petrov had been monitoring a computer system as an early warning system indicating American missiles. He got a positive on the readout, as it turns out a false positive. It was a computer glitch caused apparently by reflections from the satellites off the sides of clouds, I believe was the explanation ultimately for this. But his instructions were that he ought to pass immediately the information from the computer to High Command in preparation for a counter-strike. He took a kind of executive decision unilaterally on his belief that it was a false positive, that it was a computer glitch, and he was right. But if he'd done as he was supposed to do and passed that information up the chain, it's quite possible that there would have been a Soviet response to this ghostly American attack. And who knows where that would have led? Well, I think we can probably guess where that would have led, because the Americans would have responded in kind. In September '83, there was also an instance where the Soviets shot down a Korean aircraft, a commercial aircraft, believing that it was encroaching on their airspace, and there was some problem with radio frequencies and the people on the plane wasn't communicating properly. It drifted into Soviet airspace and was shot down by the military with the loss of about 269 people. Among the 269 people who died in that terrible event was the governor of the state of Georgia, an American politician. Obviously, this meant that the tension between America and the Soviet Union became even worse as a result of this situation. The Soviet news agency TASS tried to deny that there'd been any wrongdoing or that there'd been any kind of error on the part of the Soviets, which fanned the flame of outrage in America. Then 2 months later, in November of the same year, in 1983, a NATO exercise was detected by the Russians, who believed that it was actually a genuine military advance. And again, they were on the brink of a nuclear response, believing that they were under attack. That was prevented at the last moment. They realized at the last moment that, in actual fact, it was a NATO exercise, not the real thing. Really, there were so many things happening in the latter part of 1983 that it's actually quite miraculous that things didn't kick off at the time, because 3 or 4 events of really major significance and very, very dangerous situations were all bubbling up and happening at the same time. In the UK, tensions had risen because America had requested permission and had been granted permission to put cruise missiles on UK soil. There was a lot of resistance to this. The CND movement, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, mounted campaigns against the presence of cruise missiles in this country. There was a protest at Greenham Common, which was adjacent to one of the military bases where the missiles were being installed. A protest manned entirely by women, which became a very famous and iconic protest movement against nuclear weapons in this country. So the backdrop to Threads was an escalation of tension between the major superpowers and a sense that Britain was in some way sort of caught in the middle, and that the population were unsure about their role in this unfolding drama, except for a sense of powerlessness that things were spiralling out of our control as well.
The day has been marked by a number of demonstrations up and down the country, reflecting support for and against the government's decision to reinforce Europe. In
March of 1983, there'd been a top-secret simulation of responses to a possible nuclear attack in this country, and this was arranged by Whitehall. It was extremely hush-hush, and it involved an amazingly elaborate series of responses, even to the point of writing a speech for the Queen and a speech for Margaret Thatcher. In the Queen's speech, she was to have announced that, that to be drawing on imagery of the Blitz and saying that as the Queen, with memories of the outbreak of the Second World War, she had hoped never to see anything like it, but now we were having to draw upon the same reserves of pluck and courage in the face of a new, terrifying adversary. Thatcher's speech was a lot more pugnacious and aggressive and concentrated on a counter-response.
The ladies not for turning.
All these things were written in advance and have only recently come to light because of the Freedom of Information Act, and you can now see the text of the speech that the Queen was supposed to deliver to the country when it was decided that we were going to be entering a nuclear war. So really, if you have any feeling at all when watching Threads that it's maybe sort of slightly exaggerating the situation or is ramping up the fears unnecessarily, well, it really isn't. This was a time when not only personal anxieties were being stirred by events in the world, but actual governmental responses were preparing for the worst as well. In 1980, the government published a much derided pamphlet called Protect and Survive, which was a sort of, I think there were about 30 pages of advice about how to best survive after a blast, and it involved several rather cosmetic considerations and rather pathetic responses. Basically, hide face down in a ditch if you're out in the open, put sticky tape on the windows, stock up on Spam, that sort of thing. Make a lean-to in the hallway with a door taken off its hinges, etc. Part of the impact of Threads is that it shows people trying to draw on that particular governmental advice and shows how woefully inadequate and hopeless it really was.
Jesus Christ, they've done it.
Threads didn't arrive onto our screens as the first major drama about a nuclear attack. It had been preempted, at least in terms of chronology, by an American production called The Day After, which was screened in the UK in 1983, about a year before Threads. The big difference between the two is that the day after doesn't really get to grips with how infrastructure collapses afterwards, and it doesn't deal in the concept of the nuclear winter, which is where Threads really comes into its own.
Hanging in the atmosphere, the clouds of debris shut out the sun's heat and light. Across large areas of the northern hemisphere, it starts to get dark. It starts to get cold.
The idea that, you know, the amount of dust thrown up into the air creates giant swathes of clouds all over the country which blot out the sun, bring down the average temperature to below freezing, and you end up with a very, very long, sometimes several years long period with no sunlight, which then has a knock-on effect on crops and the ability to grow food and the ability to shelter in these, you know, shattered cities. All these things knitted together, the threads, if you like, of all these elements knitted together, once it collapses, you really are in a terrible new world. And Threads, the drama, really paints an extremely bleak picture of what would be waiting for humankind in the years after the attack. In a way, although the attack itself is terrifying and literally, you know, makes your hair stand on end, it's so shocking and intense, the attack. The real meat of the drama comes with the long, agonizing, drawn-out, dehumanizing and bleak and upsetting aftermath, and it pulls no punches in that regard. I think if you thought the worst was over when the bomb was dropped, then you're in for an extremely rough ride for the next hour of the drama, and I think that's probably what makes it stand out, is because it's so relentless.
In these early stages, the symptoms of radiation sickness and the symptoms of panic are identical.
There is, I think, a tendency in American drama to prioritize a sense of heroism and individual heroism and a kind of a can-do, we're a can-do people and this is how we're going to fix things. Well, once a major city has been flattened by a nuclear attack, those kinds of considerations aren't really appropriate anymore. And I think that's where The Day After falls down. It's still drawing on that kind of frontier heroic spirit in the way that it depicts actions afterwards, whereas Threads takes a much more pessimistic and much darker view of the way that humanity would fail to cope in the aftermath of the attack.
In the first few winters, many of the young and old disappear from Britain.
I think the thing that really makes Threads stand out in, you know, what is a relatively small field of films about nuclear Armageddon is the concentration that it brings to bear on the collapsed infrastructure and the aftermath and the failure of infrastructure to cope and the long drawn out and extremely painful effects of the attack, from the initial fallout and the sickness, the awful degradation that is caused by the fallout's effects on the human body, through to the way that in the wake of a collapsed society immediately people start to act in a more brutal and selfish way with each other. It's not long before you've got, you know, not just looting but murder for food. There's no sentimentality in the film. It's all about the human condition.
The entire peacetime resources of the British Health Service, even if they survived, would be unable to cope with the effects of even the single bomb that's hit Sheffield.
Threads was shot in Sheffield, and Sheffield City Council, which was a staunch left-wing Labour council, had lent all of their support to the production, had shared information with them, had made facilities available to them. I think at one point there was a housing estate was being demolished in Sheffield, and the Sheffield City Council allowed the filmmakers to have their way with the area and to shoot in the area. A lot of the devastation that you see in the second half of Threads was shot on an estate that was earmarked for demolition and was midway through demolition, I think, at the time. Mick Jackson's career is quite unusual, really. I mean, he went from directing BBC dramas to working in Hollywood. He directed LA Story with Steve Martin. He made The Bodyguard with Whitney Houston. He's had a kind of an unusual, very varied career. So as well as Mick Jackson as director, one of obviously the most significant people involved in Threads is the writer, is Barry Hines. Now, Barry Hines is very well known in this country for having written a novel called A Kestrel for a Knave, which was made into a film by Ken Loach called Kes. And Barry Hines worked very closely with Loach on the film, and then a few years later he wrote a drama for the BBC called The Price of Coal, Again, this was directed by Ken Loach. I think it was a play for today, but it was in two parts, so it was quite a long piece of work. He'd also written a novel called Looks and Smiles, which again was adapted by Ken Loach. Essentially, Barry Hines and Ken Loach had a very well-established working relationship. I think in some ways, apparently, this led Barry Hines to expect a certain kind of freedom to interact with the filming on threads, which wasn't to Mick Jackson's liking, and I think it led to some tension between the two men. Everyone who saw Threads at the time remembers seeing it. It had that kind of impact. It was not a programme that you filed away and forgot about afterwards. Anytime that you remind somebody of its existence who saw it in the 80s, they will immediately go, oh God, yeah, I remember that. That was really, really powerful. It was upsetting, it was frightening, and it was darker than anything that the BBC had shown, I think, really. I can't think of anything that the BBC had shown prior to that that had taken such a deliberate, concerted, sustained, bleak outlook on events. Now, I mean, part of the beauty of Threads is that it dispenses with a lot of the crutches and supports that are offered in these kinds of dramas elsewhere. I think a big part of the impact of it as well is that you're dealing with people that you've not seen very much before. I mean, the actors who are in this were relatively new to television, or were the kinds of character actor that have been doing smaller roles or unspectacular roles, supporting roles in television for several years. Nobody there are no stars in Threads, which is another big difference with the Day After. The Day After has got recognisable stars like John Lithgow and Steve Guttenberg. Threads, you don't have any familiar faces. Apparently, Mick Jackson, the director, toyed with the idea initially of casting the film entirely from the cast of Coronation Street. I'm glad he didn't do that, to be honest. I think that would have turned it into a bit of a sideshow in a way. It would have been difficult to carve a niche for the programme without having this slightly kitsch element of Coronation Street stars kind of appearing in it. So he decided not to do that and went with a relatively unknown cast. So the principal member of the cast in terms of her dramatic importance to the story is Karen Mager, who plays Ruth. Now, Ruth is the character who's pregnant, gets pregnant fairly early on in the story. And a lot of the horror and a lot of the anxiety that we feel as we progress through the film is based on this really terrible situation she finds herself in as a woman carrying a baby in a world that has gone to hell, where there's no, where you wouldn't wish a child born into a world like this, and yet she's carrying this child into this hellish new world. The critical response to Threads in this country was very positive. A great proportion of the news coverage was highly appreciative of the way that the film had been made. It inspired a lot of debate. There was a strong feeling that the rigorous scientific accuracy that had been brought to bear on the subject was admirable and had been done properly. The day after Threads was transmitted, a programme called On the Eighth Day was transmitted on the BBC, which was a sort of a panel programme designed to discuss the issues that had been raised by the programme.
On November the 1st, 1983, Moscow and Washington were linked by satellite and television for a most unusual scientific conference.
The programme had a variety of scientific and political thinkers participating, but the government itself declined to take part in the discussion, which gives you some idea really of the attitude in government to Threads. Thatcher and her cabinet were not sympathetic to arguments against nuclear proliferation. Thatcher was very much a devotee of Ronald Reagan's way of doing things, and Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan had struck up a very close accord in the early part of the 80s. I think a member of the British Medical Association wrote to her about Britain's preparations for nuclear attack and talked about Threads, and received a very terse reply from her office saying, "I'm very well aware of how bad a nuclear war would be," and the rest of the response was basically a reiteration of Conservative policy on the subject. So Threads didn't receive anything like a receptive audience in British political circles. Quite often when something controversial is shown, you get a swell of complaints and people ringing up to criticise or express their dismay or disapproval. The telephone responses after Threads were 70% positive, which is unusual. I mean, that means that something like 7 out of 10 of the callers who rang the BBC rang to commend them for making the programme as opposed to complain about something. I think that, probably quite surprising for the BBC, because usually people usually ring up to complain. They don't often ring up to praise. But I guess the feeling was that this had been a gamble, that it was quite a shocking piece of drama, and that it was also a socially positive act to have shown it. And I guess the BBC must have felt vindicated that they had such a high level, unusually high level of people ringing up to praise them for something instead of to criticise them.
Many of these officers have had no training at all. Some have learnt of their emergency role only in the last few days, and almost all are unsure of their exact duties.
When it was first transmitted in 1984, I was in my late teens, and although it alarmed me and startled me and was upsetting to watch and branded certain images onto my memory, when you're in your teenage years, you have a certain sense of indomitability as well. Even though intellectually you might be taking on board the arguments of the film, at 18 or 19 years old, you're not really fully getting to grips with what it would mean to have your life totally destroyed or rent asunder in this way. Watching Threads again now, as an older individual, I found it, if anything, more upsetting. I found that I was able to invest and enter the drama mentally in a way that perhaps I couldn't have done before. On top of that, though, regardless of my age, we're again living in a world where nuclear confrontation is on the cards again. We're dealing with a world where, if anything, a more alarming world now, because as bad as Ronald Reagan was, as bad as Yuri Andropov was, as bad as the revolving door of Russian leaders that were in and out of office in the early 80s were, one never got the sense that they were certifiably insane. Whereas now we have a situation where countries run by people that for whose sanity we fear are actually in charge of the nuclear arsenals. So in a way, I think Threads is an extremely timely release now. Part of the question that forms in your mind when you watch something like Threads, which is quite clearly a polemical piece of work and is designed to have an impact beyond just a piece of entertainment or a piece of dramatic distraction, is, do dramas like this actually have a tangible political knock-on effect? Do they change people's minds? What the research indicated was that a significant number of people's opinions did not change after watching Threads. Market research that was conducted later indicated that something like 1 in 6 people claimed that they'd had their political opinions changed by the programme. Well, 1 in 6 might not be a lot, but nevertheless, there are certain unmeasurable qualities in the response to a drama like Threads. There's no way, really. I mean, a piece of market research can tell you so much, but over the years, to what extent people over time started to modify their beliefs on the subject of nuclear proliferation is a bit harder to measure. And also, we don't know to what extent the friends and family of opinion formers and politicians would have weighed into the arguments at home and helped to shape policy through that sort of influence as well. It's difficult to say, and really, I suppose, you can't measure the value of a drama by numbers in that way. I think most importantly of all, what we should ask of a piece of drama like this is that it tells the truth. And whether or not it has an appreciable, measurable, researchable effect on a sizable proportion of the public is perhaps, well, A, hard to tell, and B, secondary to the important thing, which is that a piece of drama should tell the truth. And what Threads did, and even its critics had to admit, was that it told the truth in a totally unvarnished way about the actual, genuine detail of the aftermath of a nuclear attack.